Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending this webinar on the economic outlook for the state of Mississippi. Let's get started. I don't think we want to waste anyone else's time. We've got a quorum here. All right, so here is what the webinar will look like. We're going to start by briefly talking about who REMI is and what our models do, because we've used our models, of course, to do all of the forecasting that we'll show you in this presentation. Then we'll move right into the regional growth matrix that we've come up with, where we've graphed all 50 states plus DC on two axes, population and employment. We'll see where Mississippi is on that matrix. Then we'll look at the short and long-term economic outlook first for the entire United States, just get a little bit of the big picture. And then we'll zoom into Mississippi and dive right into more detailed analysis of the short and long-term economic outlook. We'll finish the presentation with a model demonstration by my colleague May, who will do she'll pull up the model live and share her screen, and we'll get to see it work in action. And then that should take just about half an hour, maybe a little longer, and then we'll leave a couple questions for a couple minutes for questions at the end. So moving right along, REMI, Regional Economic Models, Inc., was founded just over 40 years ago on the idea that government decision makers and private industry leaders should be cognizant of the consequences of their actions before implementing them. We're the nation's leader in dynamic local and state and national policy modeling. We have clients ranging, as you can see, this is not an all-exhaustive list at the bottom, but ranging from state and federal agencies to local or regional governments, or NPOs, EDCs, etc., as well as private industries from all different sectors of the economy. So most of what we do here at REMI is build the software models, update them with all the data available, and then get them out of the hands of our clients. All right, let's move right into Mississippi. Here we'll paint with the broadest brush strokes what the economy looks like today. For most of Mississippi's history, cotton was the main agriculture crop, but as the agriculture sector declined over the late 20th century, the crop dwindled and now is produced at relatively the same rates as catfish from aqua farms, livestock, sweet potatoes, soybeans, and even broiler chickens. Lumber and wood products are also a booming industry in the state of Mississippi, as well as relatedly furniture, but other manufacturing includes car parts and processed seafood products, interestingly enough. Drilling is also a major industry in the state of Mississippi, both crude oil and natural gas. And the welfare system and the public medicine system in Mississippi are both necessary for a lot of the folks in the state, and public medicine in particular there have been some incredible successes there in that state. Okay, this is a quick snapshot at the short-term outlook for Mississippi. Later in the presentation, we'll get more in depth, both short and long-term, but we wanted to give you a little taste at the beginning. So we've run the REMI model for a 5-year period from 2019 to 2023. Those are the graphs at right. As you can see, not quite by 2023 does the state of Mississippi get back to where it was 2019 pre-COVID employment levels. Though personal income does continue to grow into 2021, largely due to stimulus checks, we imagine. But just over the course of 2020 and 2021, personal income should grow by about 4.0%, GDP by about 4.7%, economic output by about 4.8%, and there should be about 59,000 jobs that are generated by the end of the year. Of course, I want to preface all of this economic forecasting by saying there's a certain level of uncertainty in all of this. Large pent-up consumer demand is an open-ended question, right? How pent-up is it? As well as the continued vaccine rollout, which is looking good and continues to gain momentum, but these are all sort of unknowns. So wanted to say that once at the beginning. I'll also say now that we get our data from a number of different sources. All of our models get our data from that's the same few sources, and then we also, the transportation model would pull additional sources, for example. But all our models get data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Bureau of Economic Activity, the Congressional Budget Office, the Census Bureau, as well as the University of Michigan's Research Seminar in Quantitative Economics, which releases their data quarterly. So we've been updating our forecasts also quarterly, with the most up-to-date information possible. So I'll highlight that last bullet point, which is footnoting the University of Michigan's seminar, which includes the $1.6 trillion stimulus package passed last month, as well as, to the best of our ability, the vaccine trends and consumer spending expectations. So moving right into the regional growth matrix, I'll explain it and then I'll show you all where Mississippi, is on the map. So there are two axes. So I'll start with economic or employment factors. So these are things like industry growth, the pay in those industries, the level of productivity, the cost of doing business in the state, those types of things. And demographically, we're looking, as you might imagine, at the age of the population, the number of people retiring, immigration into and out of the state, as well as the quality of housing and other amenities. So here are the two axes. Population is on the x-axis, employment is on the y-axis. I'll start at the top right quadrant and move my way around just to explain all four of them. Starting with the growth economies in Colorado and Texas, these are economies where both population and employment trends are relatively favorable. So industries are growing pretty rapidly, people are attracted to the states and continue to move there at relatively high rates. And the economy is otherwise looking up, at least as compared to the national average. So those are our growth economies. Our lifestyle economies in the bottom right quadrant have high population expectations, so people are continuing to want to move to that state, even if the employment trends are slightly below the national average. So Virginia is a great example of this. Transitional economies in the bottom left, Maine and West Virginia are both pretty good examples. Both employment and population trends are below the national average. So often these state economies are undergoing some sort of transition, but they're usually losing more people than they're gaining in terms of population, and their industries are not growing as fast as they are in other states, neighboring states. And finally, the Renaissance economies. Massachusetts is a great example of this. These are economies where the population trends are relatively unfavorable, so people aren't moving to the state as frequently. The state may even be losing folks, but employment trends remain popular. So whether that's older industries being replaced by newer and higher growth industries, or relatively high pay over the course of the last few decades, whatever it is, employment trends remain above the national average. So let's, without further ado, see where Mississippi is in this graph. Okay, so as you can see, Mississippi has slightly below average, at least compared to the US, employment and population trends. I should preface this by saying we're only looking at 2021 and 2022, so we've only compared it to the national average over those 2 years. But Mississippi should expect to lose some people over the next 2 years, or at least grow at a much slower rate, not quite losing people, but grow at a much slower rate. And employment will be growing, but not quite at the same rate as it will elsewhere in the country. So now we're going to zoom out and look at the entire US. I'll pause here for a second. So looking in the short term, just over this 5-year window from 2019 to 2023, we can see the blip in 2020, both graphs at right, but by 2023, national employment gets back up just above where it was at pre-COVID 2019 levels, which is good to see. Over the course of just 2020 and 2021, personal income has grown by about 2.9%. GDP will, by end of year, have grown by about 4.4%, same with economic output, and employment should be at 7 million jobs by the end of the year. So some things are looking up. REMI's models run out to 2060. So we've run our forecasts out to 2060. So over this 40-year period, We expect to see an average growth rate per year of about 1.9% in personal income nationally, 1.8% in GDP, 1.9% in economic output per year, and just over 1 million jobs added to the economy each year on average over the next 40 in the entire US. And these graphs at right will be available. We'll give you the slides in a few business days after this webinar, so you'll have access to those as well. Now let's zoom back in and look more in depth at Mississippi. So we'll look at employment by industry, especially the industries that are growing the fastest. We expect to see by the end of the year, just over 22,000 jobs added in those industries alone. Those industries include healthcare, construction, and then a large other category in green, which includes religious organizations, civic organizations, grant making, any private household income, personally and laundry services, those types of industries. And here we'll look at the industries with highest average annual compensation. You can see manufacturing is at the top, followed by wholesale trade, and then the other three. Blip in 2020, but fairly quickly getting back up to almost where they were in 2019 levels by the end of 2023. So here's a snapshot of the population at the end of this year. So it's a pretty stationary population pyramid, which is telling us that, well, it's a good sign. The birth rate is relatively equal to the rate of aging and death. So often states with a stationary population pyramid have obviously low birth rates and usually overall quality life. Overall quality of life is high. So here's another more detailed population graph. We'll read it from left to right like a book. So our starting population is almost 3 million in Louisiana, and in Mississippi, apologies. And births outweigh deaths by a bit. And as you can see, our economic migrants roughly equal the number of retirees from other states, other retirees from other states moving into Louisiana, and the number of people from other countries moving into the state. So our ending population is slightly higher than it was in 2020. Yes, now long term, over the same 40-year window, just looking at the state of Mississippi in isolation, we expect to see the average growth rate per year of personal income be 1.8%. GDP should grow by about 1.5% per year. Output also by 1.8% per year. And we should see about 5,000 jobs added to the state of Mississippi each year. So again, looking at the employment by industry, though, over a 40-year time period, as you can see, the industries are changing dramatically. Healthcare and social assistance is a much greater part of the pie. Professional, scientific, and technical services, as well as accommodation and food, both are also taking up a much larger chunk. And that all other, which again is religious, grant making, civic organizations, personal and laundry services, other private household employment, is still making up almost a third. We should see over the next 40 years just under 130,000 jobs increasing in the top 5 fastest growing industries. And again, these industries with the highest average annual compensation rates include manufacturing at the top, which remains over the course of the 4 decades that we've run it relatively stagnant with a little bit of a dip and then a rise again. And we should see wholesale trade slowly, ever so slowly, declining in the number of jobs that it brings to the state of Mississippi. This is an interactive population pyramid, so we can see it run over the 4-decade period. I'll let it run twice. Okay, so it's just ending there at 2060. So this is a snapshot again at 2060. as you can see pretty clearly, it's much more of a constricted pyramid at 2060. So, you know, the population is elderly and shrinking. So these types of pyramids, or states that have this type of a pyramid, usually have many fewer people in the younger age cohorts, and characteristic of an economy that has, you know, relatively high social and economic development. This is a trend all across the entire US, though. Most states, at least, the populations are becoming much more constricted when we look in the long term. Gonna skip this graph for time. All right, so we'll move on to the model demonstration. I'll hand it over to my colleague May, and she will share her screen and give us a taste of what the model looks like live.
Thank you, Julian. So in the model demonstration part, we will run a scenario of an optimistic outlook. We have seen the national baseline quarterly of the RSQE, CPO, and BA, where the total employment slowly comes back, accompanied by a steady growth. But as Julian mentioned, there will be a lot of uncertainty, including the large pent-up consumer demand, supports of vaccine, and also stimulus checks. Though it's very difficult to quantify all these impacts, we would like to try a little experiment inspired by Janet Yellen, who predicted that economy could be back to full employment by the end of this year, 2021. We wanted to test what growth we will have to see in the economy to make that happen. And after testing, we imported a macroeconomic update increasing the GDP growth rate by 2%. So now let's move to the next slide and look at the employment changes both on the national level and state level. On the left, there is total employment in the US, and on the right in Mississippi, with the blue lines representing our baseline forecast and the orange lines representing the forecast where growth in every component of GDP has been increased by 2%. So if consumption grew by 0.5% from year to year, now it grows at 2.5%. With that, the US gets back to normal by 2021 and even begins to exceed its previous employment in 2022 and 2023, while Mississippi is having a very similar recovery. But please bear in mind that a 2% increase in the components of GDP growth is a very optimistic outlook. So only if the vaccine rollout continues smoothly or ahead of schedule, and if consumer confidence really picks up, we might see something approaching this. Now I'm going to share my screen and to show off the model. And we will explore more about the drop increase from the baseline forecast to the optimistic outlook. Here, the model we're using is the 51 region model, which covers the 50 states as well as the DC area. We're looking at REMI model PI+, and this is its home screen. The purpose is to provide quick and simple access points for starting the use of REMI model and to simulate policy changes. By clicking on the appropriate tile, you are able to start creating any one of the 4 types of forecasts available in PI+. Regional simulation, national simulation, regional controls, and national controls. If you're interested in exploring REMI's default control forecasts that form the basis of the model, you can dig directly into the data by clicking on regional forecast or national forecast. Let's do regional forecast for now. It will be open and it shows only the results section. Some specific tables, maps, and data visualizations have been specially chosen to display REMI's baseline forecasts and as well provide informative profiles of the national and regional economies. In the slides for the short-term and long-term outlooks, we used national control to import the March update, while for now we're importing another update. Here we're using new national control again, but here in macro economic values instead of the baseline, which is update in March 2021, we're doing the optimistic outlook with 2% increase in the GDP components growth rate. So here we have it as the macroeconomic change in the input list. The next step is to run the forecast. Let's skip the running because it's going to take a couple of minutes. So let's jump directly into the results section. Here's what we just imported. We have the lower line representing the baseline and the upper line representing the regional simulation for optimistic outlook. The gap here between these two lines are just the GDP of these two outlooks for Mississippi. And as a result, this is what the total employment look like. Again, we have the lower line representing the baseline and the upper one for the optimistic outlook. We can see the gap here, which is the differences between the total employment of these two outlooks. It's increasing over years. Besides total employment, we can also look at employment by industry here. We're showing the main sectors with 23 industry sectors here. We're looking at the levels, which means the exact number of jobs here. But since we're more interested in the change, we can make the comparison type into differences. So now we can look at the differences between these two outlooks from the baseline to the optimistic outlook. By zooming in, we can see that the top industries are state and local government, retail trade, as well as healthcare and social assistance. These three industries are contributing the most job increase from the baseline to the optimistic outlook. Another very interesting comparison type is percentage change. So here, instead of the actual number increasing, we're looking at the industries that are growing the fastest. We have retail trade again, federal civilian, and services industry, other services. You're also able to change the industries into more detailed levels. In this level, we have 70 industry sectors, and if needed, we can also do 160. Hopefully that can give you a better idea what is happening behind the increasing total employment from the baseline to the optimistic, outlook. I will now give it back to Julian for the conclusion.
Thank you very much, May. That was great. Okay, so what have we learned in this 24 minutes? Well, first, we sound like a broken record, but economic forecasting can be hard. I mean, there are things that you can't predict, like a worldwide pandemic. That would be one of them, as well as, the added uncertainty of the election of a new president and state and local governmental changes as well, on top of the already general uncertainty around economic predictions. However, REMI actually can help. Our forecasting tools are pretty robust. We often talk about the 3 C's of modeling, sort of the 3 general categories or reasons why people might use our models. So the first is to clarify a complex policy problem, pick it apart into its different pieces, and highlight the specific connections between them. The second is to calculate the quantitative, like hard data, for a grant application or an impact report or anything like that, where you need those numbers. The third is to communicate, better to policymakers, the public, whoever, and actually bring the economic impact argument in. So yeah, a lot of different reasons you may be interested in our models. I think the most interesting thing of the REMI model is that because we're dynamic, meaning 2 things. One, we can forecast out into the future and show those changes over time, as well as what happens in 2021 affects what happens in 2022, affects what happens in 2023, etc. So for both those dynamic reasons, we are able to ask the conditional question. We're able to ask what if this would happen, or what if policy A would be implemented instead of policy B? What if we cut the numbers in half, right? Like you can do all of those more detailed calculations. And the last thing I will say, it is in our name, but it bears repeating. Our models are regional, so they all are looking, at specific regions, and you can look at the regional effects of policy between different areas as well. At REMI, we think that in order to see the big picture, you need to zoom in and look at the localized, detailed effects of policy. So that's why we're doing this economic outlook series for all the states. So thank you for attending the Mississippi webinar. We appreciate